What if the most powerful... Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with someone who needs to understand what is really going on behind the headlines. Trust me, this story is way bigger than what the mainstream media is telling you. Let us start with what happened. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military operation against Iran. The Americans called it Operation Epic Fury. The Israelis called it Operation Roaring Lion. And what they did was unprecedented. They targeted the very top of the Iranian government. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who had ruled Iran since 1989, was killed in a devastating bunker strike. President Donald Trump confirmed it himself, calling Khamenei one of the most evil people in history. But it did not stop there. Dozens of senior Iranian officials were reportedly killed in the strikes, including the Chief of Staff of Iran's Armed Forces Abdolrahim Musavi, the head of intelligence for Iran's Emergency Command, and even former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gave a press conference, saying this was something he had yearned to accomplish for 40 years. The Israel Defense Forces launched strikes directly into the heart of Tehran. American B-2 stealth bombers were deployed. 3 American service members lost their lives. 5 more were seriously wounded. An Iranian warship, a Jamran-class corvette, was sunk by American forces in the Gulf of Oman. Airports across the Middle East shut down. More than 14,000 flights were canceled or disrupted. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical waterways in the entire global economy, was effectively thrown into chaos. And that, my friends, is where China enters the picture. Now, here is the thing you need to understand. While the bombs were falling and the world was fixated on military footage and breaking news alerts, China was already making moves. Within hours of the strikes, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was on the phone with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. They held what was described as urgent consultations to discuss the repercussions and to prevent the region from sliding into what they called a dangerous abyss. The Chinese Foreign Ministry issued a blistering statement calling the killing of Khamenei a grave violation of Iran's sovereignty and security, a trampling of the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, and a blatant violation of international conventions. But here is what makes China's response so fascinating. They condemned the strikes forcefully, yes, but they did not threaten military retaliation. They did not deploy warships to confront the Americans. Instead, they did something far more calculated. They positioned themselves as the reasonable adult in the room while simultaneously working behind the scenes to ensure that whatever comes next in Iran serves Beijing's long-term interests. And to understand why this matters so much, you need to understand the depth of the China-Iran relationship. It goes way deeper than most people realize. China and Iran established diplomatic ties all the way back in 1971. In 2016, when Xi Jinping visited Tehran, they elevated the relationship to what they call a comprehensive strategic partnership. Then in 2021, they signed a massive 25-year cooperation agreement worth a reported $400 billion. That deal was supposed to transform Iran into a critical node in China's Belt and Road Initiative, the most ambitious infrastructure project in human history. We are talking about Chinese investment in Iranian energy, banking, telecommunications, transportation, and dozens of other sectors. In return, China would receive a steady, guaranteed, and deeply discounted supply of Iranian oil. And here is a number that should blow your mind. China purchases more than 80% of Iran's shipped oil. Let me say that again. 80%. In 2025, China imported an average of 1.38 million barrels per day of Iranian crude and condensate. That accounted for roughly 13% of all the crude oil China imported by sea. And most of these purchases were made by independent Chinese refiners known as teapots, clustered mainly in the Shandong province, who were attracted by the steep discounts compared to non-sanctioned barrels. But the relationship goes way beyond oil. Iran joined China's Shanghai Cooperation Organization in 2023 and became a member of BRICS in 2024. These are not just diplomatic photo opportunities. These are institutional frameworks that give both countries tools to coordinate against Western pressure. And just weeks before the strikes in January 2026, something absolutely massive happened that barely made international headlines. Iran, China, and Russia formally signed a comprehensive trilateral strategic pact. This was described by state media in all three countries as a cornerstone for a new multipolar order. The agreement covered everything from nuclear sovereignty and economic cooperation to military coordination and diplomatic strategy. It built upon the existing bilateral agreements, but for the first time formally linked all three powers in a coordinated framework. Now, this pact was not a mutual defense treaty like NATO's Article 5. It did not obligate any of the three countries to defend the others militarily. But it created something that some analysts argue is even more powerful in the long run. It created a permanent framework for consultation, coordination, and strategic alignment among three of the most significant non-Western powers on Earth. And the timing was no coincidence. This pact was signed as tensions between the United States and Iran were reaching a boiling point. Trump had already deployed 2 aircraft carrier strike groups to the region, the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Gerald R. Ford. He had given Iran a 30-day ultimatum to agree to American demands on its nuclear and missile programs. The writing was on the wall. And China was not just signing diplomatic documents. They were also deepening military cooperation in very concrete ways. In the weeks leading up to the strikes, Russia, China, and Iran launched what they called Maritime Security Belt 2026, joint naval exercises in the strategically vital Strait of Hormuz. Chinese spy ships, including the Dayang Yihao, a so-called scientific research vessel, had arrived in the Arabian Sea and was shadowing the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group. The Liaowang-1, a Chinese maritime space tracking ship, was escorted by a Type 055 class destroyer and a Type 052D destroyer into the Gulf of Oman. These vessels were monitoring Western naval movements, providing intelligence support, and tracking American missile defense activity in the region. Commercial Chinese satellite imagery had even revealed the deployment of American THAAD missile interceptors in Jordan. But now that Khamenei is dead and Iran is in chaos, the question everyone is asking is, what does China do next? And this is where it gets really interesting. Analysts who study Beijing's behavior have long described China's approach to Iran as strategic opportunism. China is not sentimental about any particular regime. What China cares about is stability, access to Iranian oil, and making sure that whatever government emerges in Tehran does not become pro-American. The Brookings Institution put it perfectly. China is much more important to Iran than Iran is to China. That is the fundamental asymmetry in this relationship. And Beijing knows it. So right now, China is playing the long game. They are already engaging with Iran's Interim Leadership Council, which was formed after Khamenei's death. This council is made up of the president, the head of the judiciary, and a member of the Guardian Council. Beijing immediately opened communication channels with these interim leaders to ensure that existing agreements, especially that $400 billion cooperation deal, remain intact. And there are reports that China favors pragmatic figures within Iranian decision-making circles, particularly leaders who support what analysts call an eastward orientation, meaning leaders who want to strengthen ties with Beijing and Moscow rather than pivot toward the West. One name that keeps coming up is Ali Larijani, a former speaker of Iran's parliament who has deep connections to Beijing and has been instrumental in shaping the strategic partnership between the two countries. But here is the part that should really make you sit up and pay attention. The crisis in Iran is not just a challenge for China. In many ways, it is an opportunity. Think about it from Beijing's perspective. The United States has now committed massive military resources to the Middle East. American attention, American money, American political capital, all of it is being poured into this conflict. And while Washington is tied down in the Middle East, what is happening in the Indo-Pacific? What is happening around Taiwan? What is happening in the South China Sea? This is the dynamic that multiple analysts have flagged. A prolonged American engagement in the Middle East gives Beijing greater freedom of action in its own neighborhood. And there is another dimension to this that most people are not talking about. The strikes on Iran have sent oil prices surging. Some leading investment banks like Barclays and J.P. Morgan have warned that a prolonged conflict could send oil prices to $100 a barrel. Now, China is the world's largest importer of crude oil. In the short term, losing access to cheap Iranian oil hurts. China will have to find alternative suppliers, potentially at significantly higher costs. The inflation shock could be very real. But here is what is remarkable. China has been preparing for exactly this kind of scenario since the early 2010s. Beijing has been systematically diversifying its energy sources, building massive strategic petroleum reserves, expanding oil imports from Russia, the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa, and most importantly, investing in renewable energy on a scale that no other country on Earth can match. What many Western observers interpreted as climate policy was equally a national security strategy. Every new solar panel, every wind turbine, every electric vehicle reduces China's dependence on the very geopolitical vulnerabilities that are now playing out in the Middle East. This is long-term strategic thinking at its most sophisticated. And let us not forget the diplomatic dimension. China is positioning itself as the voice of reason on the world stage. While the United States and Israel are dropping bombs, China is calling for dialogue, restraint, and respect for sovereignty. At the United Nations Security Council, China has wielded its veto power to block Western resolutions against Iran for years. Now, with the assassination of a sitting head of state, Beijing has even more ammunition to present itself as the defender of international law and the champion of the developing world. Wang Yi explicitly called out what he described as the unacceptability of attacking and killing the leader of a sovereign state and inciting regime change. And the reaction from the broader global South has largely echoed China's position. Pakistan saw protests outside the American consulate in Karachi. Massive demonstrations erupted across the Muslim world. Even some European leaders, while supporting the goal of preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, expressed unease about the scale and nature of the operation. Now, there's one more angle to this that I think is absolutely critical. Remember that Trump is scheduled to visit China from March 31st to April 2nd. This would be the first visit by an American president to Beijing in 9 years. The planned trip was supposed to focus on trade, particularly the expiring trade truce between the two countries. But now everything has changed. One Chinese national was confirmed killed in crossfire in Tehran. More than 300 Chinese nationals had to be evacuated from Iran. If more Chinese casualties emerge, the entire visit could be called off. And here is the deeper strategic concern for Beijing. The strikes on Iran remind China of what happened in Venezuela earlier in 2026, when American special forces captured President Nicolas Maduro and flew him to the United States to face drug charges. Chinese analysts are drawing a clear connection between these two events. The lesson they are taking away is that the United States under Trump is willing to use surgical strikes and regime change operations against nations it considers hostile. And if Washington can do it to Venezuela and Iran, the question that haunts Beijing is, could they try something similar closer to China's borders? So what is China actually doing about all of this? They are doing what they always do. They are playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers. They are using this crisis to strengthen their diplomatic position, to deepen their institutional alliances through BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to accelerate their energy diversification strategy, to expand their influence in the Middle East by presenting themselves as an alternative to American militarism, and to quietly prepare for whatever comes next in Iran by cultivating relationships with the people who are most likely to hold power in a post-Khamenei era. One analyst from the Middle East, I described it this way: what we are witnessing is not traditional alliance politics, but something entirely new, a form of strategic partnership designed for a multipolar age. China offers Iran diplomatic protection, institutional integration, visible military cooperation, and an economic lifeline, all without crossing the line into direct confrontation that would trigger a wider war. If rescue means ensuring that Iran can survive, resist, and eventually negotiate from a position of strength, then the answer is quietly, persistently, and strategically yes. And that is perhaps the most important takeaway from everything that is happening right now. Xi Jinping is not trying to fight the United States militarily. He does not need to. He is building something far more durable. He is constructing what one commentator called a shield forged not from steel but from strategic patience, economic interdependence, and the architecture of a rising multipolar world. The question is whether Washington understands this. Because right now, America is winning the military battle. The bombs hit their targets. Khamenei is dead. Iran's leadership is in disarray. But wars are not just won on the battlefield. They are won in the markets, in the institutions, in the relationships that are built when the dust settles. And on that front, Xi Jinping might just be the biggest winner of this entire crisis. The Middle East is being reshaped before our eyes. The old order, the one where the United States could project unchallenged power anywhere on the planet, is crumbling. And in its place, something new is emerging. A world where China, Russia, and a network of aligned nations are building alternative systems of trade, finance, diplomacy, and security that do not depend on American approval. Whether you see this as a threat or an opportunity depends on where you sit. But one thing is certain. The world after February 28, 2026 is a fundamentally different place than the world before it. And President Xi Jinping knows it. That is it for today. If this video opened your eyes to what is really going on behind the scenes, smash that like button, subscribe to this channel so you never miss an update, and share this video with everyone you know. The more people who understand what is happening, the better prepared we all are for what comes next. I will see you in the next one. Stay informed, stay sharp, and never stop questioning the narrative.